Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and part one of a three-part introduction to the concept of living history, or reenactment, or recreation, however you want to label it. And we will, in fact, be talking about the label later on the show. So if you follow me on Twitter, you will know that when I announced this back in, I think it was November or December, I was going to go quite deep and we're going to talk about the wearing of Axis uniforms and the morality of that. Well, we're not doing that this time. What we're doing this time is presenting three shows, very much the positive side of living history, and then see what the reaction is. And then I will tackle perhaps the meatier topics of wearing German uniforms on a future set of dates. But right now, this is to advertise the hobby in a sense. So the three shows, just to let you know, part three is kind of with professionals who aren't necessarily living historians themselves, but see the benefit of it. They're kind of museum workers. Some of them have been reenactors, and they're going to kind of talk about how reenactment, living history, is used in a visual media environment within museums, things like that. Part two, which is tomorrow night, are people who do it professionally. I know some of today's guests have also done these things professionally, so there's a bit of overlap between the shows. So tomorrow night, it's people who work with film, education of schools, things like that, talking about how it works in that environment. But today, to start off, we are talking about the participants, those who do it. And I will admit right at the beginning, I was a living historian for about 20 years. My last event was in 2004 for the 60th anniversary of Arnhem, and I was there with, I think there are about nine Jeeps with Vickers K guns, and there's about 50 of us there, and it was really fantastic. But then I knocked it on the head to become a tour guide, and now I'm talking about it. So I have been one of the subject we are talking about tonight. But without further ado, I'm going to bring in my guests. So we have three from the UK, one from Jersey, and one from the USA. So all men tonight. We will do a show with females at some point, and we have Kate with us tomorrow night. But Ed, Joshua, Simon, and Rowan. So those of you who have read the YouTube description, we are going to be putting to these gentlemen a variety of questions. And the question number one, easy one to start it off, is how do you actually define yourself? Because I use the words living historian, reenactment, reenactor, educator. So we'll start the order they are on my screen. So I'm going to bring in Ed to begin with, because he was the first online pre-show. So Ed, you're also an Army reservist. So you've got some professional experience, but what do you define yourself as?
Well, I think first and foremost, nice to see you all. Ed Brooks, Montys Men, World War II British. I define myself as a reenactor. If a member of the public walked up to me and said, "What do you do?" I'd say I'm a reenactor. But secondly, soldier, and once a soldier, always a soldier. That would be how I define myself.
That's a good start. So let's move to Joshua next. How do you define yourself?
Joshua Kerner from the 100th Infantry Division reenacted. Like Ed, I define myself as a reenactor. I think the best send-up of the various terms in the hobby came from Roland Curtis of At the Front, who is a major reproduction vendor that I'm sure at least all the people that do GI are well aware of, and I'm sure others probably are aware of. I think other terms like living historian, unfortunately, are oftentimes used by other reenactors who try to set themselves aside from the wider hobby and pretend to be more authentic than they are without actually doing much materially to improve their impression in terms of research or authenticity standards, or to change that perception more widely. But that's probably the topic for a little bit further into the show. But I think for the most part, reenactor and a reenactor who specializes in living history is how I like to define myself, and how I think others in my unit tend to define ourselves.
Super, good response. I'll go around to Rowan next. So Rowan is from a Scots at War. So Rowan, same question to you. What do you define yourself as?
Well, I tend to use terms living historian pretty interchangeably. I think sometimes people use living history to lend a bit more sort of weight to what they're doing and a bit more legitimacy. And my group calls itself the Living History Society, but really I think they mean the same thing, and I'm not too bothered about which one I'm called. Super.
And I'm interested already that you're giving answers that I wasn't thinking you were going to give. But we'll move to Simon next, who's just over the channel from, well, the other channel, the side of Normandy. He's over in Jersey. So same question to you, Simon.
Yeah. Hello, Paul. I think we use the term interchangeably. I run a small group in Jersey here called Force 135 Living History Group. So that gives you an idea of where I lean. But I think both terms are interchangeable. I think if you are actually recreating a historic event, using the term re-enactor is perfectly appropriate. But I use both terms interchangeably. I have no great interest in, either have the same weight as far as I'm concerned.
Super. And we've already got a question from Brad on this day in Canadian military history, who say, can we get a terminology rundown at some point? And that's a very pertinent question, except I think we'll all give different answers. I mean, even in how we've defined living history reenactment, it's not that there's a universal definition. There's not a universal definition of how to maintain any kind of standards. That's one of the things we discussed on the original show we did on World War II TV back a year and a half ago, is that one person's idea of standards is not the same as someone else's. And that, of course, for those who are watching this, who are more used to the fact I have historians and authors and things on, and by the way, you guys are historians by the fact you communicate history, so you are also under that banner, is there's people who define themselves as popular historians, academic historians, some people define themselves as storytellers. They're all terms that each person would use differently. So I think unless we can come up with a universal dictionary definition, and even then I think people would argue with it, it's everyone's interpretation is entirely different. So, well, we know what we do. We know what we define. Mostly we're happy with the term reenactor, which is good. So people who are watching who don't understand why anyone would do it, this is kind of the next question leaps into this, and we will talk about defending it later on, but the next question is going to be, what do you get personally out of wearing World War II, or in Rowan's case, primarily World War I uniforms? How do you feel it enhances your understanding of the war? So I'll go around different order this time. Let's start with Rowan first. Let's go with Rowan again.
Well, I think for me, it's mainly for the bit. I'm probably going to be slightly different from the other guys. Well, I'm not sure what you all do, but I am an academic historian normally, and this is sort of my hobby that I do for fun, which means I can sort of begin to experience a bit of what my research is about. But I think I've heard a lot of people talk about education and even things like doing it to honor the dead or the veterans. And while that's a noble thing to do, really for me, I think it's more about sort of the fun of it and getting a bit closer to the research.
Makes sense to me, and I'm glad people are going to be honest, because that's the pat answer, isn't it? When people are asked to defend why they do that, you've got to, well, I do it for the veterans, I do it to honor the past, I do it to educate, and of course there's that aspect of it. But given how much it costs, and perhaps we'll do as a bonus question just how much, but perhaps if your wives or significant others aren't listening, we can ask you to say how much you've spent on recreating there's probably an official vote. Ed is already, there's massive protests coming up now. But the point is, folks, it is very expensive. I think I worked out when I was in Arnhem in 2004, I was standing there in about £1,500 worth of gear, ish. And that didn't, but I worked out that was quite surprising. So we'll move to Simon next. So why do you do it, and what do you think it has? How has it helped you understand the past?
The liberation of Jersey, which is what we recreate, is an annual commemoration in the islands, and it's a very important, very special day for Jersey. To be a part of it is very special for islanders who have family and relatives who lived through the occupation by the Germans, and that moment of liberation, that freedom, is really it's a very special day for us. I do it because fundamentally I enjoy it. I enjoy the camaraderie. I enjoy the research. I enjoy the history. I enjoy researching various events that happened, recreating them if possible. And there's if you spend a wet, muddy weekend in a hole in the ground with a group of your friends, by the end of it, there's just a tiny bit of that. There's a tiny bit of that camaraderie that the guys at the time experienced, and you find that you make lifelong friends with some of the guys that you do this with. You know, I've been doing this for probably 20 years. I really enjoy it. You know.
Well, a brilliant answer, and let's move to Joshua next. You're muted. You're muted, Joshua.
Sorry about that. So, like Simon, I do it because I really enjoy doing it myself. I like hanging out with the friends that I've made the hobby, and the way I reenact, I do because doing it right, and we're not going to get into doing it right versus far, gives me the most enjoyment. The research, the assembling of a correct impression brings me a lot of enjoyment. And I think it's important to do it right. And this is probably getting a little beyond the scope of the question, because I think one of the ways the hobby has any value larger to society, if it's somewhat quasi-academic and allows and grapples with the history that it's trying to interpret. What probably is more interesting is how we came to reenact the 100th, the group of guys that we do, and that we initially were a unit that was going to do multiple different U.S. Army impressions, and one of those was the 100th because one of our members' grandfather was in the communications platoon of 1st Battalion headquarters company of the 399th Infantry Regiment of the 100th Division. And we had done a couple of events doing that. And then we got invited and participated in the last national reunion of the division. And after attending that event where we filled out tons of veteran survey cards, talking to the veterans that showed up, participated in a wreath-laying ceremony with them at the National World War II Memorial, we kind of gathered around and we're like, we should just really focus on these guys because they're a really interesting bunch of guys. And kind of went on from there. We met Carl Fleck and Ray Howler, who were mortarmen and a replacement in B Company. And from there, we got in contact with Don Donahue, who was also in B Company and was a real wealth of information for us because he ran a company association and had a company newsletter for many years. And without his help and the resources that he had mustered well before some of us were born or were truly interested in World War II, the authenticity that we were able to achieve and the enjoyment that I got from being able to do that level of research just wouldn't have been possible. So I do it because I enjoy it, but the enjoyment comes from the investigative research and using that research that I've assembled to assemble that impression from it. So
brilliant. And just because you probably wouldn't say it yourself, I mean, one of the reasons I particularly invited you, Joshua, is because of the articles you have written ostensibly for your unit, but then in turn have provided information for a wider field, us non-reenacting historian folk, because as you said, the 100th Division isn't a unit that, you know, gets much praise. Everything is 101st and 82nd and 29th. And so by wanting to improve your hobby within a group, you have added to a database of knowledge about that division in World War II. So even the people who, there are probably some watching this who do not like living history, cannot deny the fact that living historians, and Rowan has already said is an academic historian, are adding to our knowledge of the past. So whether people like it or not, this is a contributory factor to looking back at the past. And you know, when we have Taff Gillingham on tomorrow, the information he had through being a living historian, he took to film, so that films like 1917 and all the other productions he worked on have a higher level of authenticity because of his background as a living historian. So that is undeniable. So we'll have Ed as our last response to that. So basically, Ed, why do you do it? Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Ed. Nope, can't hear you. We've lost you. Okay,
Totally
so
lost me.
oh, no, we're back. You're back.
You're back.
Now you're muted again. We'll come back to you in a second when we work out what's going on. So Rowan, we'll go back into because you say an academic historian. We've already had a question on the sidebar, Rowan, about what branch of academic.
Can you hear me now?
We can now. We'll
Sorry.
just.
I kicked
I'm
the
going to go to
cable
Rowan
out.
because you're in the naughty step now, right now, Ed. So I'm going to just bring Rowan in one more time because we had a question from the sidebar about what aspect of history Rowan is actually working in day to day. So let's bring in Rowan in to ask that question too. So, yeah, what do you do on day job, Rowan?
Yeah, well, at the moment, I'm just finishing off my master's by research in I'm working with the Black Watch from 1902 to 1914, and hopefully I'll be doing the PhD on the same topic, taking it up to 1918. So I'm very much at the beginning of my career with that, but I've had a few things published, worked on a few articles and stuff. And I think living history has always been something I've done as a hobby, sort of separately to that, but it's very much tied in with it. And it's sort of been, I know I said before, it's sort of a hobby, but it has been an interesting opportunity to bring my research to a wider audience. If I'm researching officers of the Black Watch and I portray an officer of the Black Watch, which is especially interesting when I'm uncovering a lot of personal stories, and I'm able to sort of portray the people who, actually, bring it to life. But and I'm very fortunate to have a good number of people who are willing to be private soldiers and follow me about and do that as well. But it does bother me that I don't think living history enactment or women's has some reputation amongst academic, something that I would really like to change. And I'm currently involved in a book. It's called A Re-enactor's Handbook. It's been produced by the Islands and Islands. And that's sort of aimed at living historians and also bodies which would employ living historians like museums and things like that, heritage bodies, to sort of try and establish certain standards and also show to the bodies, people who might employ reenactors, that it's up sort of almost disrespectful thing, that it is an important part of academia and heritage. Well,
brilliant stuff, and it sounds like you'll get a lot out of Friday's show, because that's exactly what we're talking about then. Marcel, who's joining us from the Netherlands, has been photographing living historians to use to make sort of 3D modeling things for museum work. He's involved in all sorts of projects in Europe, and that idea of bringing in living historians to create a visual medium is something that is the way forward in terms of interpretive history. And speaking of myself, we'll go to Ed in a minute. When Mag and I were at the museum in Ypres about 4 years ago now, and I'm not a big First World War buff. World War II is my domain, but the museum is brilliant there. But the thing I remember more than anything else is the bit they did about the Christmas truce, because they had this holographic figure that was kind of projected. So you'd have a German soldier, then he would go, then the Scots soldier would come in, then there'd be a medic from an English regiment or something, there was a French civilian or something. And as each one was talking, the ones on the side were also kind of moving still and kind of nodding along. When the Germans started whistling, whatever it was he was whistling, Silent Night or something, the other guys started whistling it. And I've forgotten most of the information I read on the panels because it was just words. But the visual recreation of using these actors, because ultimately living historians are actors. The word that you all selected, reenactor, is an extension of the word actor. We're bringing that history to an audience, and that's what I remembered. But so, yeah, that's going to be very much the topic of Friday. But we've got to bring Ed's opinion about why he does it. So Ed, hopefully you're back in again now. Pressure's on. No, we've lost you again. We can't hear you. Oh dear.
Hang on. Hang on.
Oh no, we can now.
Yeah.
You can hear me now.
You got you now, yeah.
Okay. So I kicked the cable out. It was as simple as that. and the USB is a bit unhappy now. Right. The honest truth is, when I'm doing it, I hate it. When you're on a proper Montys Men and you're out in the field on exercise for 5 days, and you've had 2 hours sleep a night, and you've been run round, and you've been made to do things which you would never normally do, most of the time, if it's going properly, you shouldn't be enjoying it. Okay, it's misery. So I think that probably answers the question. I do it for the experience. And I'll elaborate on that on some of your further questions, but it's all about the experience for me. There isn't often in life now that you get to do stuff. Modern life is fairly timid. You know, I know recent events may have changed that in some of the world, but that aside, unless you're a police officer, a firefighter, frontline healthcare, or a member of the armed forces, you don't really get to do stuff. People go thrill seeking. I call it thrill seeking, going climbing mountains and all that type of stuff. Well, Montys Men is my little kick when I get to do stuff. And I own a 1942 Bedford vehicle, and I own lots of expensive battle dress. That's my vehicle in the background there, actually, behind the Jeep. There aren't many opportunities as a Brit to go and pretend that you are a soldier shooting at an enemy who is, in your mind, evil. So for me, it's all about the experience and the misery of doing it, because I'm not going to lie, it is misery when you're doing it.
I admire your honesty there, and you know, in my time as I'm still a battlefield tour guide, you know, when I'm talking about people moving, for example, inland from Gold Beach on D-Day, where the Green Howards did, or I talk about the 30 Assault Unit, whatever it would be, covering distances, I think back to the Dunkirk march I did in 2000, where the medic was, this is a disturbing comment, you know, siphoning pus out of my heel, lying on my stomach on a park bench somewhere near Harvebrook, I think we were at the time, and you know, put my boot back on again and I had to get a ride in the vehicle, and I was just shot to pieces. But that memory of just doing distance in hobnail boots will stay with me. I think I still actually have a scar on my right heel from the Dunkirk march. So thank you, Johnny Hayworth, for taking me on that. 22 years ago, you bastard. I'm still suffering. So, do you? I'll go to Joshua again now. You were nodding a lot during Ed's talking there. If you're doing living history properly, it should hurt. Is that kind of a fair statement?
It depends on the sort of living history you've done. We've done events where we're portraying the division as it's being demobilized back in the United States, and of course that's pretty cush and nice, as it would have been as they're back in the United States. But I've had my share of long marches, sleeping in foxholes. There was one event where in the middle of the night, I felt my hand get a little damp and cold, and I just put it out of my mind. And when I woke up, I was coated in an inch or two of snow. So if you're, one of my friends who isn't in my unit, but once said, for when you're doing a field impression, you should really be digging a foxhole, because if the public wanted to see a field of tents, they could just go to the local campground, you know. And I think that sort of foxhole living, which is really needed to accurately portray an infantryman overseas in combat, kind of engenders a certain harshness of the sort of living condition like Ed is talking about. That's not always what's needed or required. We've done events where we're portraying the unit on a war bond tour, much like the actual division did. We've portrayed them during training at stateside. We've done the division from activation to demobilization, but a large bulk of it, for a variety of reasons, is focused on combat. And when you're portraying the unit in combat, you should strive to have an nth of the discomfort that these guys were going through the days and days and drudgery and toil that they would have really been going through.
No, perfect, and it kind of brings up, I think, when we were talking about people asking about to break down the terminology, a lot of reenactment, stroke living history, is not really the recreation of battles, because essentially, especially Second World War, you can't really create combined arms battles in a field. I mean, because combined arms had air power and strategic bombing and naval gunnery and massed artillery aggros behind and 30 guys kind of running across a field towards a haystack, which we've all seen done, doesn't necessarily really convey what war is about. But what you are conveying is how men move about. You can convey small unit tactics. You can convey drill and things like that. So I'm interested to bring Simon in again here, because Simon, of course, of the four of you today, is the only one who is doing this in a country that was actually occupied by the Germans. Germans were marching up and down Jersey for 5 long years. And so when you're walking around, okay, you're technically you're post World War II reenactor, because you're recreating the occupation force, the British occupation. I mean, the liberating force.
Yeah.
But that brings on a whole level of extra responsibility, in that people there can remember Germans going down the street.
Yeah.
So, do you think you come at the hobby from a slightly different angle than the others because of that extra layer of responsibility?
Yes, very much so. We are recreating real events in the real locations where they originally occurred. So there's a great deal of responsibility to do that as accurately as you can, with the sort of respect and dignity that should be shown to an event of that nature. Thankfully, we don't portray combat, because there wasn't any combat in Jersey. We are a liberating force. The terms of surrender had been signed aboard a HMS Bulldog just offshore, and then the liberating force 135 came ashore and effectively enforced the terms of the surrender. So we're moving all the Germans away. We're making safe munitions, but certainly there's no combat. There's no digging holes. It's quite cushy, really. And the other side of the coin as well is that Force 135 was made up of some of the very last manpower reserves of World War II. So the guys who comprise Force 135, which is a composite force of Army, Air Force, Navy, you name it, and civilian affairs units, those guys were in their 40s, 50s, and beyond in many occasions. So it actually extends my living history career perhaps a few more years from now. Which is nice, which I probably wouldn't want to do if I was portraying a frontline fighting unit. But yes, the requirement to get it right and do things well is paramount for us.
Which brings us up to the next question. I'll carry on with you, Simon, as you're on the microphone, about how it's hard to ask you to kind of promote yourselves now, gentlemen, but I'm going to kind of ask you to do it, because the question, we talked about why you do it personally, but now it is about what do you think you yourself or your group has done to kind of improve our knowledge of history. So let's stick in Jersey, Simon. Do you think people who see what you're doing there have a better understanding what the occupation was about by what you're doing?
Absolutely. It is still in living memory, but of course the veterans unfortunately are leaving us at a very fast rate. Most of the people, when we do a public show, most of the people that we see have never seen a soldier in World War II uniform, and there's all sorts of questions. I mean, we try and do things, for example, like we'll have the facial hair. This will be gone. We'll have the mannerisms. We'll try and smoke a fair bit. I myself smoke a pipe, which is simply unheard of nowadays. And the kids point at my mouth and say, "What's that in your mouth?" Because I don't think they've ever seen somebody smoke a pipe. But we try and recreate that momentous moment in time, right at the end of the war, when the Third Reich was in ruins, the Germans were surrendering in droves, and there's just that feeling of utter relief. It's very special.
Cool. And I mean, and having, you know, I live near German bunkers like you live near German bunkers. So
Yep.
there can be this idea that people kind of forget that they were there for a purpose. They have become part of the landscape now. And, you know, indeed, normally there are some that have cafes on top of them, or they have
Yep.
they've been incorporated into other projects. So as the war recedes into the past, people are not necessarily associating those things with what they actually represent. They've been kind of accepted as part of the walls, the structures, and things. So when you go out there and you know, you have done things where we're not really bringing up the subject of German reenactment in these 3 shows, but you have, for various photo shoots and stuff, recreated the fact there were Germans there. You have you certainly show the fact these bunkers were a military thing. So how do you approach taking your group to a place where there are bunkers there? What is there anything, any kind of extra layer of concern you bring in because of, again, where you are?
Not especially. The Channel Islands had a very large number of bunkers constructed. It was Hitler decided to call them the sort of anchored battleship in front of the Atlantic Wall. We have a vast number of bunkers. And they were all untried in combat. So if you want to see sort of pristine examples, Jersey's definitely, or the Channel Islands are definitely the place to come. In terms of us doing what we do, which is the liberation of the island, we don't really have much to do with the bunkers. It's more we've done some sort of clearance photos where we're there removing the ammunition and removing the weapons. And we've done some work in clearing mines on beaches, that sort of thing, some photographic work for that. But to be honest, the actual bunkers themselves don't feature significantly in what we do. It's more about the civilian and the civil aspects of the liberation. The fact that the islands remained under a British occupation for 3 months is something that isn't really known. And it's just about portraying that to the best of our ability.
Super. Well, we'll move to someone else now because we will. And I'm going to move to Ed now because Montys Men, what's unique mostly about Montys Men is that you don't do your stuff in front of the public. It is mostly for your own. You were famously at Chalk Valley History Fest. War Fest, James Holland and Al Murray's War Fest last year, where a few of you were there and you were playing around with tanks, which is kind of cool. But most of your big events are just for yourselves. The public aren't invited. So defend that. I know you aren't the chief of Montys Men, but defend the reason why Montys Men doesn't do it in a public environment generally.
So Warfest would have been the first public show Montys Men's ever done, really, and the objections within the group to going and doing that were massive because the general consensus amongst members is that the general public aren't really that interested. You know, they come up to you and ask a question. Oh, is that wool? You know, that doesn't tend to go down with people that take themselves extremely seriously. I would probably be one of the Montys Men attendees which takes themselves least seriously. But there was a massive amount of worry of us going to Warfest. And actually, as it worked out very well because it was a very targeted event looking specifically at the British experience of World War II. The honest truth is they don't do it in public, any of their events in public, because that's not what their objective is. Montys Men, we're doing it for our own personal reasons. We're not there to educate. I understand education is important, but the honest truth is the reason that most Montys Men guys are running around is for the camaraderie, the experience of doing it. So I think, has it helped me to personally understand history? It's helped me personally understand what the blokes that were doing it felt like, because there isn't any other opportunity that you'd get to dress up in wool and go and run around when it's 30 degrees and give yourself heat stroke, which you know happened. It personally, it helps me understand the personal experiences that individuals had, and it maybe only gets you 1%, 2% closer to what they really felt. Because the honest truth is that I've got no idea why someone would want to experience real war. There is no reason that you want to experience real war at all. we're seeing it on TV at the moment. You know, it's perfectly obvious why you don't want to experience real war. So it's not about that. It's about Monty's Men is about the individuals. And you said something very interesting earlier, Woody, about armies being big things. Okay, it's not just 30 guys. So, and one of the things that Monty's Men is trying to do is it's trying to incorporate. So we're trying to get that scale, because most groups is a nucleus of 8 to 12 men. Because guess what? 8 to 12 men don't tend to fall out with each other. Once you get over 12 men, you get two different groups with different opinions, and neither of them's wrong. And then they start to fracture. So it's very rare you can get a group of 100 guys together in the same cap badge, doing the same thing with the same objective, following the same orders process. That is an extremely rare thing in reenacting on the whole, let alone British. We don't know of any other British group that quite does it, because we bring all the British groups together. So it's trying to bring 6 or 7 different British groups together for one objective. And what we're trying to do now, and one of the reasons we did Warfest, there's Dodkins, you can see Dodkins in there. What we're trying to do is armour the Cromwell, trying to get the integration between infantry and armour. So if anyone out there's watching and they own a 2,000 acre estate, they'd like to let me come and trash, you send me an email. Yeah, we're trying to get that integration between large-scale infantry and armour. It's that personal experience of that interaction. You know, sitting back and watching 90 guys walk away from you. You know, even the guy who runs our unit turned to me and said, "I didn't think that hill was that big." We're on top of that hill, actually. And Greg said, "I didn't think that hill looked that big when we planned the event." And yeah, it's very, very rewarding. So it does make me personally understand it. I just want to say one other thing before I take too much time. If you want to feel good about yourself, go and shoot at a Nazi. It really is as simple as that. You know, there was a reason that the guys did it. There was a reason they made the personal sacrifice to take the risk, because there are some things in life it's just worth fighting for. And going and pretending you're shooting at bad guys, cowboys and Indians, all that type of stuff, will make you feel very good about yourself very, very quickly.
I want to go back to the point you said earlier there about I forgot. I've lost my train of thought completely there. Happens to be sometimes about the idea that, oh, I know what it was, that no one would really want to go to war, because that is something we'll do the negative side. What some people think about living history is that why do you wear uniforms? Does that mean you want to go and fight a war? I think the honest answer and the truth answer every living historian and reenactor would say is no, of course I don't want to go to war. I just want to understand what it was like for those who had to go to war. And you made the point there, Ed, about the fact that people don't know what it's like to run around in wool, in hobnail boots. Kids wear trainers all the time these days. They don't understand what it's like to wear heavy boots now, and the equipment they wore, and the itchy wool and the itchy this. And Joshua's laughing now because dressing up as an American, they don't have itchy anything. Everything is nice and comfortable over there.
They're dressed for a round of golf.
So, you know, but the point is, moving forward, it's bringing it up to kind of connecting with Friday's show again, and even tomorrow's show, we talk about the work in the film, is that to then convey to actors what it's like to be in uniform, to convey to a museum goers what the misery of being a soldier, that you can't recreate warfare in a field as a reenactor, no matter how big the group is and how many tanks you've got, but you can use that to convey to other people just how bloody miserable it was. So let's bring Rowan in now, because we haven't talked to Rowan for a while. Because the Scots at war, particularly, you know, you're involved conveying First World War, Second World War, and, you know, earlier than that. And, you know, places like Edinburgh Castle and other places in Scotland have an association with, you know, festivals and tattoos and comedy festivals and all things like Scotland. So what is it about trying to recreate Scotland's military past that you think? How are you helping to educate or convey that to an audience, Rowan?
Well, as you say, we do a lot of stuff around these sort of big sites like Edinburgh Castle, places like that. We do some immersive stuff as well. Although I was going to follow up on sort of what Ed had said before and just sort of say that really when we do something like that, you're maybe learning, you're getting 1%, 2% closer. You're learning one or two things as you go through. You're sort of getting incrementally closer to what it was like. But although you're never going to completely be there. And what we do to do it as exercises or sort of pre-war training scenario rather than having an enemy there. Just for that reason, so that we sort of don't have to suspend disbelief. But some of the stuff that we do, and I'll pick up on this photo that you've got up just now, the trench that's there, that trench was dug. It's a redug trench. It's an original trench from the war that we've redug in Dunfermline from part of the defences around the town of Dunfermline in Fife. So this was for an event in Fife. The time it ran properly was in 2019, which I think when that photo was taken. That's it in a bit of a sorry state on the Sunday of that event. But so we basically had the opportunity to recce these trenches, work out where they were. There'd been an archaeological dig there before. We had qualified archaeologists in, and we could dig these trenches in the shapes that they were. We did actually have to turn it around the wrong way in that because they built a wall behind it since then, and it was rather blocking the field of fire. But we were essentially able to dress in the same as the battalion who were there in 1940-41, in the exact positions that they were in, and really get quite close. And I think it's quite similar to sort of what Simon's done in Jersey. Is it Jersey? In that you've got the actual positions, you've got that piece of local history there, and we're able to try and bring that to life a bit more. And that's the sort of thing that we really like to do. We're looking at doing a sort of garrison impression of Fort George later this year, probably, which will be the Edwardian period. And again, it's about bringing an impression of the people who were in this place to show the people who are there now. So yeah, in Scotland, the stuff that we're doing is very tailored to the local area, local regiments. Obviously the immersive stuff, not so much, but the public stuff generally is.
And just to kind of, you were talking about your work, you're writing about the Black Watch and trying to convey their history. The reality is, for the people who are watching this who don't like living history, is that if you attend an event at a castle, let's say it's Edinburgh Castle, more people who are passing through that castle will see 2 or 3 reenactors sitting in a trench than will ever read a panel that says in 1939 there were soldiers in this trench. And if they do, even if as many people read the panel, they will have a much better memory of actually physically seeing 3 blokes sitting in that hole than they will reading it. That's why I was coming back to visiting that museum in Ypres. The visual stimuli of seeing something actually moving. We're going to come back to the smell of tanks, the exhausts, and frankly the smell of blokes in battle dress, which after a while has its own distinctive aroma. That's not very accurate use of the word aroma. A stench, I think, is probably more accurate. So it's this idea that the people who don't like this hobby, the fact is it is going to carry on and it is going to be happening. And we're not going to talk about the crappy people doing it, because we can't stop the crappy people doing it. We can't stop crappy reenactors any more than people who are writing good history can stop the people who are writing bad history, any more than I, hopefully having a good World War II living history channel on YouTube, can stop the people doing crap World War II history on YouTube. All I can do is raise my bar and keep my standards high and hope that I do the best. And that would be what you guys are doing. So I'm going to bring Joshua in now, because I want you, Joshua, to expand on this writing you've done, because I've put it in my words, but the writing you've done, articles about weapons systems from the war and uniforms, that your knowledge as a reenactor has been paramount to how you've been able to write them. If you had just been a jobbing worker in a museum and someone said to you, right, Joshua, write about the 100th Division using bazookas or whatever it would be in 1945, you would have done a poorer job if you hadn't been a reenactor. Is that true? Well, I know that's true, but expand on it for me.
So I'm trying to think of the best way to start. So because of our interest as a U.S. unit, and we were coming across the standard secretary sources that so many people consult, and we were finding, frankly, wanting and lack academic rigor. And our unit is almost entirely focused in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States. And for those who aren't familiar with the United States, around the Washington, D.C. area, for a variety of reasons, there are a large number of archives related to World War II. You have the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park. You have the Army Heritage Education Center. You have the George C. Marshall Foundation, the Institute of Heraldry, the Quartermaster Corps Museum, the Ordnance Corps Museum. So instead of relying on these iffy books and these iffy, oftentimes collector books that are often, well, I bought a 41 field jacket in 1985, and this is what the guy at the gun show told me about it. So here it is in a Schiffer Publications book. We decided to go to the direct primary sources and just get them ourselves. And since then, I personally have spent hundreds of hours at dozens of archives across the United States gathering this information, and my compatriots in the unit have done that. And we first kind of got the idea to write articles from looking at the 90th Infantry Division Preservation Group, which wrote articles more focused on reenactors. And we had ourselves contributed some articles there. Like, I'd written a review for a jacket. My friend Tom had written basically a how-to guide to do research towards reenactors. And what was happening is within the unit, we would ask questions like, man, like, we're about to do a machine gun squad, for instance. How are like pistols distributed? And when we're talking to the public, it's not enough to be like, yeah, this is a pistol, and the public goes, so what did soldiers think? And it's like, that's not helpful. It's useful to go, well, this is actually what soldiers thought. And because we've gathered ourselves, or through the help of the old division association, gathered several hundred memoirs from the division, as well as have gathered hundreds of observer reports, combat lesson documents from the U.S. Army that were assembled during the war, we can kind of go, well, checking with the more or less randomized opinion of several hundred World War II soldiers, turns out they didn't really like the 1911. Like, there's one quote that I just came across that was great, where the guy was like, where it's a sarcastic rant about how useless the 1911 was. So we started kind of writing those up, because the best way to take a jumble of thoughts in your mind is to kind of put them to paper, and it kind of organizes yourself, sees where there might be gaps, and allows you to then go back and fill those gaps with further research. And then once we started doing that, it kind of became a no-brainer to start just putting that out online for everybody to see. So we've done stuff where, kind of like how you alluded to, we've gone through, and we haven't gone through all of them. It takes time to write these, and the more photograph and sources that we assemble for our research, the longer it takes to write any one of these articles. Not only on our weapon systems, we've done ones where we've looked at our specific regiment and gone, all right, let's look at the hood for the 1943 field jacket and when it was issued to this unit, when we could start seeing it. We've done that for looking at how mail was run. We've looked at it at photographs carried in pockets, because the U.S. Army had something called IDPS, which stands for Individual Death Personnel File, which basically, when a soldier died, one of the parts of that, and it's included in the file, is they inventoried all the person's personal items. It's a little morbid, but there's no better way to get an idea of what, in your specific unit at that specific time frame, what the average Joe Schmo private first class infantryman in a rifle squad actually carried in his pockets in terms of personal items, than a somewhat random sampling of what the U.S. Army was finding in their pockets when they were inventorying them for death. And from those articles that were kind of both aimed at the reenactor community and a little bit in certain ones towards the more general historical community, we've also written articles that are more aimed academic. We've had articles published in World War II Quarterly, American World War II, the AMED Historian, the 29er, which is the newsletter for the 29th Infantry Division Association, and Army Lawyer, talking about various things, whether it's the use of the F word during the war by the U.S. We've written about a war criminal who, after the Biscari massacre, was recycled into L Company of the 399th Infantry Regiment and claimed to be an insane sniper. And it's an interesting article to read. And we've also kind of did a critical review, I should say, of Etched in Purple, where Tom Kelly pretty definitively showed that this guy lied about his World War II service in this memoir. And his memoir is more or less really a novel. And why it's important to critically read memoirs and how one should do so. And so I think hopefully at the very least, people on the US side, when they read our articles, go, wow, there's a lot of shit in these archives. We should go there ourselves and grab what we can, because there's a ton. But I hope in any given one of those topics, they learn something new. And I think people have, because we could see trends. Sometimes it's immediately after, sometimes it's about a year after. We could see trends that our articles point out that are now kind of common in the USGI reenactor space. Like we wrote an article looking at guys carrying gas masks in the US Army into ETO. And one of the things that was interesting, and it surprised me when I started writing this thing, was that actually in our mind's eye, soldiers immediately looked at the gas mask, said, this is useless, and then chucked it. And what kind of was discovered by looking at memoirs and other things is that the U.S. Army was aware of that and changed its policies to try to discourage that. Not in the way, oh, they were fine, but like the U.S. Army was like, you don't need to carry that anymore. We're going to keep the gas masks and everything like that in a truck, and we'll issue them out as needed, which meant that they weren't in the possession of soldiers to be thrown away. It kept them better preserved for the Army. But what that did mean is that once that change happened, that soldiers are actually less likely to throw them away because, oh no, we got issued our gas masks. That means the high command thinks that we're going to be gassed soon. You know, better hold on to it for at least a little bit longer than I think a lot of people assumed. And that was verified in memoirs and photographs and stuff like that. And I think that kind of shows how doing this sort of research from a deep material culture aspect could kind of show interesting things more widely and aren't just pure butt encounter dumb stuff, which I love. Like I've scanned too many field jacket specifications to pretend otherwise, but can be interested into cultural things and how an army deals with cultural problems more widely.
Well, I mean, what a brilliant response to that question. And I'm now thinking to myself that for those who are watching this, who might be watching it later, who disapprove of living history, I could have invited you on, Joshua, to talk about the 100th Infantry in 1944-45, and you could just come on as a historian of that. Simon could be on as a historian about Force 135 in Jersey for 3 months. Rowan could be on talking about the Black Watch in 1939, for an example, and Ed could be on about being uncomfortable. No, I mean, I'm sure you could do more than
Ed, right.
The point is, though, is that it's the time. The key word you said there, Joshua, was the time you have spent, because your proper historians who are writing histories of units like the Sherwood Rangers or the Black Watch in World War II or whatever it would be, they are busy trying to find out where units were on certain days. They're trying to find out how many battle casualties. They're trying to understand the movements across the terrain. That's your primary reason for getting history across. You guys have done the work on that the detail there, so that if, for example, historian A is looking for period photos of the Somerset Light Infantry in Normandy, the Montys Men guys have poured over every single one of those photos to such a level they could probably go, yeah, we know that's definitely someone set in our infantry, and that's definitely 4th Battalion, not 7th Battalion, because in our research we've noticed that 4th Battalion seem to always carry their mess tins on the right hand side or whatever it would be, and that's the kind of knowledge that living historian reenactors should be able to pass on to conventional historians.
Sorry to just put in there. And one of the things that I'm really proud of in the 100th that we've been able to do is also get onto that unit history aspect, in that, so you could choose a given day, and we've done it, just choose a random day that the 100th was in combat. We can tell you exactly who was in the company on that day, who was out sick, who was wounded, what rations they were issued, how much ammunition they expended, and we could probably place you within a couple dozen yards of where they were, because we've digitized at the National Archives all the overlays. We know what map sheets those overlays go with. So, and with all the memoirs we've digitized, the after action reports that we've digitized, the unit histories that we've digitized. When I went to France a couple of years ago with my girlfriend, we got dragged off the trip a little bit because I wanted to go to Bitch, where the 100th Division spent a lot of its time, and I created my own battlefield walk and was able to go, all right, here was 1st Platoon B Company's foxholes, and I really didn't even have to do too much prior prep, because with a mixture of Google Maps, the period maps, and the overlays and after action reports, I was able to put everything together. A bunker, and I was like, okay, this is the bunker that Juan Meza of 1st Platoon took when they came upon it in early December. Here's Flanagan's Fortress, where was the company headquarters, and during the Nordwind offensive, the anti-tank platoon of headquarters company drilled some 57 millimeter rounds into after the company headquarters dispersed, and the like. So I think units that allow themselves to truly specialize into one specific unit, whether that's a specific company or a larger unit like a division, and only do that and nothing else, allows them to dig deeper and be able to expound more on that to a level that many unit historians at a more academic professional level might find difficult or even impressive, because in this case, it's not just me having to research the 100th and going to the National Archives and grab these documents. It's my friend Tom Kelly, or Julian Chalafoux, or Charles McFarlane, or Tyler Newcomer, all collectively researching this division. And I'm thinking of, we interviewed this one guy named Robert Reinhard, who was a ammunition bearer in the 2nd Machine Gun Squad of the 4th Platoon of B Company, 399th Infantry Regiment, the unit that we really focus on. And halfway through the interview, he turned to his wife and said, "These guys know more about the company than I do." And I think that's kind of the goal that we have set for ourselves, that we could arguably be more informed about the company and the division than many of the guys that served in it. So yeah. Sorry to butt in there, but
no, it's good. I mean, but which brings us back to the original point about, because all you guys enjoy it, or except for Ed, but no, you enjoy the principle of it. Therefore, you are putting the time in because you want to. And professional historian, although we were accepting that Rowan is a professional historian as well, and I'm a kind of I'm a professional historian. There's only so much time in a day, and you guys have done work that then can be used by other people. I'm particularly interested in what you said about the Understand the Etched in Purple book, because when that, I'm going off on a tangent, one of Woody's tangents now, when that book D-Day Through German Eyes came out 2 or 3 years ago, that all the historians have basically poo-pooed it and said it's nonsense. The Holger Eckert's accounts, where he basically, well, we now know he made them all up basically. But the people they asked to kind of verify, is that book true, with the rivet counters, they were the people who know vehicles or they know the battles. What they didn't ask is reenactors, because I think with some of those German accounts, German reenactors, which we're not tackling this, we could have said, there's no way that's right. That guy is describing kit, not the way they wore it. That's not, because the guy is fabricating, whoever wrote those fictitious accounts was fabricating stuff. So he was looking at photos and going, I'm going to just make up a story about Fritz behind Utah Beach based on what that photo tells me, but a reenactor could probably read the account and go, he's got that all wrong, because you wouldn't. I'm not going to give any details of what he might get wrong, because my analogy doesn't go that far. But for example, Rowan might be reading a book, a bit of historical fiction about a black watch guy in 1949. Describe him, I don't know. He's late for parade, and so he threw his uniform on in 5 minutes and made it. And Rowan would go, no way, there's no way could an officer get his uniform on in 5 minutes. That's something that he, as a reenactor, could add information to disprove something that, because he's actually put on a uniform and no, it doesn't. It takes you half an hour, whatever that figure would be. And we can perhaps ask Rowan how long it would take to get dressed as an officer in the Black Watch in 1939 as a later question. But I'm hogging it again now. I want to, if anyone else want to talk about any things they think their group has particularly brought to show off what their group has done. Anyone else? Anything else they want to say on that?
I would just
Joshua
like to,
what a surprise.
Sorry. So besides the articles, we've assembled over 10,000 photographs of the division, not only from the Signal Corps, but also from veterans, most of all of them scanned in high definition, 600 DPI scans, saved as TIFFs, all on the website. And we've also, 2 years ago now, spent a quite substantial amount of money digitizing in 1080p HD all of the division's known motion picture footage at the National Archives. And not only did we digitize that footage, we went through and I scanned all the documents for the 163rd Signal Photographic Company, which was the company that actually took all that photograph and film, digitized their document, and then married using the unit histories of the 100th Division and the unit stuff from the 163rd to try to give as much background information as possible to what you're seeing in the motion picture footage. So it's not just guys from D Company walking through a field in France. You could see, oh, wow, this is what the D Company history says. Here's what a memoir from a guy from that company says. Here's what the 163rd described happening that day. Kind of marry it all together to bring context, because a random photo from World War II is almost useless. It's the context from the caption and the history of the unit that really makes it useful as a historical object. So we've done that. And then because we've digitized so many documents from the division, including the general orders, the index to general orders, we routinely get progeny from the division emailing us going, hey, my grandfather was in the division, what can you tell me about him? And I can be like, well, here's his award for the combat infantryman badge. I was able to tell one guy about his Silver Star medal and how he won it. And it was actually a crazy one, because he was taking out some machine gun nests, and he got shot in the face by a German, and he then killed the German that shot him in the face, which I assume was a massive surprise to the German that shot him in the face. He's like, I should have killed you, you know. And then also here are memoirs from guys in the company that your grandfather or father was in, who mention him and talk about him as a person. And being able to kind of do that is one of the things that I actually really enjoy, and because it's not only the detective aspect, you also get to see some enjoyment from a family member that may have had a imperfect or less than optimal understanding of their relative's service during the war, really be able to go, wow, like my grandfather was a hero, or wow, my grandfather was just an artilleryman that didn't do a ton, or anything in between. And that aspect of what the 100th has been able to bring to the table has been makes me feel quite good, and it's something that I'm quite proud of.
And you should be. And you know, I'm hoping there's people watching this who are going, I thought these guys just sat in fields with machine guns in front of pup tents. I thought that's what they did. And if we're helping to change people's perceptions, then we are doing something good here, because the catalogue of information that reenactors, living historians have brought to the general history community goes beyond your incredible website. And you know, the 10,000 photos and the footage, and the link, by the way, to all these gentlemen's groups is in the descriptions below, their Facebook pages and groups there. Please go and check them out yourself. But Ed, having kind of we talked about Montys Men, the fact you do your events for yourselves, but you want to jump in and say and add some stuff about what you feel you've contributed as a group to the wider world. So let's bring you in again, Ed.
Yeah, so Joshua raised a lot of important points about research and the individual units and the level of detail that the Montys Men guys go to. Pete Marshall, Dickie, Ramsey, going into things like compo rations, what they're actually eating, what the exact menus, and trying to recreate it on a scale for compo crates for 90 blokes, and then seeing what the effects are when you've got no toilets in the fields and you've got to go and dig latrines. Those experiences you don't really read about in books, or if you do, they're in very niche memoirs of individuals who very, I suppose, books that you wouldn't read, you wouldn't see on the shelf in the library. So they go into immense detail about the individual units and what their customs were as well for the post-event phase. And Joshua said quite an interesting thing about looking at how he felt he knows more than some of the veterans he meets, and sometimes they say to him, "You know more than we do." Well, you probably do, and Montys Men's the same. Take the orientation of the tartan flash here for KOSB. The amount of effort that the group had to go into to find out how that should be orientated, to the extent of the actual museum, the KOSB museum didn't know, and we had to go through their archives to find out. And then it turns out that each battalion orientates it a different way, so it is complex. And there is this weird, so Monty's Men go to the highest standard because it promotes realism when going through the experience, but there is this weird I'm trying to think of the word, there's this weird sort of irony in that the guys that did it didn't give a monkeys. And I will highlight an argument which goes on every Montys Men. There is an argument about the colour of blanco that the webbing should be. I guarantee you, if you sit down with any veteran and say to them, what colour was your blanco? They'd look at you and go, green. They don't care. The people that did it were doing it at the time, and they had more important things to worry about, like staying alive and where your next meal was coming from. And the majority of the people that did it, and the same is true now of the modern army. If you go and talk to any Scotty and say to him, oh, what pattern of boots do they wear? If he tells you what pattern of boots they are, that means he bought them himself. If he doesn't know, it's because they were issued. So, like all this stuff I'm wearing, and I've got all the kit that we spend hours of money and time and effort on to get it right. The people who did it at the time, that was not their focus. Their focus was, is it going to keep me warm? Is it going to keep me dry? Is it? So I think we all strive to go for the highest standards. That all of us do here. I know that because I've fought with Mr. Dodkins, and on a Montys Men, we all strive for the highest standards. But sometimes I think too much effort and emphasis gets placed on something not being quite right, when at the end of the day, the people who did it at the time, they really didn't care. As long as you're 99% of the way there, you're never going to get it right. It's 2022. I mean, we use a lot of original kit. That helps. The more original kit you can use, the better. But it's becoming more difficult to find, and it's very expensive. So yeah, Montys Men would have contributed similar to Joshua's group in trying to get the historic research right and the actual kit right. But sometimes I feel that it goes too far. Now, I suppose there's only one other thing to say. It has to be fun at the end of the day. And Montys Men is fun afterwards. And there are two elements to a Montys Men. There's the doing it, and there's the after bit. And the after bit is brilliant. I won't say any more. It is brilliant. It's brilliant, the most fun you can have with all your clothes on legally.
Wonderful point. And I'm going to take a moment to just move on from that comment there. But you and Joshua, and I'll bring in Simon and Rowan in a minute, that you make a very pertinent point, is that as reenactors, you are looking for different details than other people who are looking at history are looking for. So if a museum is wanting to get its display right about the 2nd Battalion KOSB in Normandy, for example, they're going to be looking at what, making sure their panel is about. They kicked off on June the 12th, and it's, they're going to be they're taking that note from the war diaries. They're going to be looking at the casualty figures being correct. They're going to look at the maps of explaining where they're moving being correct. They're not necessarily going to be looking at what had they been given field rations the day before? Had they been given a hot meal by the Army Catering Corps? What were they going into the line with this or with that? Well, that's the kind of thing the reenactor is looking for in the photos. That, you said yourself, Ed, about the work Ramsey does on the combo rations, as I know, because I used to make up replica stuff. Yeah. There's very little written down anywhere, because as you say, the blokes, as long as it was hot and they fed them, and even if it wasn't hot, as long as it kept them alive, that's all they cared about. They wouldn't have remembered whether it was, do you remember what brand beef it was you had in 1943? They won't. They'll look at you like you're insane.
Yeah.
You will be looking for that information. You'll be poring over photos for different details than Peter Caddick Adams is, or James Holland is, or Don McManus is. And that is the point of the validity, I think, of living history as another branch of understanding the past. It is a valid point. And so I'm going to bring Simon and then we'll go to Rowan again, because Jersey has a fair number of museums, isn't it? I mean, they acknowledge the history there. There's tunnels open, there's bunkers open. But I'm sure that as a living historian, as a reenactor, whichever label you prefer, you can see things that you could improve from your knowledge of gear, and maybe you have advised these museums about gear.
Gosh, yes. I won't name the local museum, but they had a liberating soldier as a uniform on a mannequin with a turtle style helmet, and it was back to front, and they had no idea until you gently pointed it out. But I mean, just to go back on some of the points there, research is so important. It's absolutely research. Can't do enough of it. I'm always rummaging around in the Jersey archives. I'm always looking through museums, through diaries, through first-hand accounts to try and find just that little bit of extra information, an additional nugget that just. And that's one of the pleasures of the hobby, is just finding something fascinating. I'll give you one example. Totally out of the blue, I was contacted by a lady in the UK who was going through the papers of one of her uncles, and it transpired that he was a member of 29 Field Ambulance that was part of Force 135, and was trying to trace when he came to Jersey, what he did, and all the other stories. So I was able to find out through research, through the date he came ashore, what landing he came on, and then we uncovered a really interesting story that he'd been one of the first 5 of his unit ashore, and he'd gotten completely lost. He had to go from the harbour across town to where the German hospital was and take control of the German hospital. And he had gone off on a tangent and had gotten completely lost. 5 guys in a potentially very dangerous situation with enemy troops wandering around all over the place, and they're field ambulance guys, so they're not combat guys. And we found out that a local child had said, "Oh, I'll take you to where that is," and had taken them there. And what a fascinating little story. And we were able to recreate the route, to find out where they went, find out where they got lost. And I'm really looking forward to meeting the family that's supposed to be coming over this year. And it's going to be a really nice time to connect with them and just show them where their uncle was. Just little things like that. That's what makes the hobby so much fun for me. So much.
Brilliant stuff. Let's move to Rowan, because Rowan is our academic historian and reenactor. So to kind of finish off this section about the learning, the research, the unique question I'll put to you is, how does your reenacting help your academic history, and how does your academic history help your reenacting?
Well, I think my reenacting definitely helps my academic history. When I was an undergraduate, I sort of really found that arguing with people on Facebook about the color of Blanco and stuff like that, or on Twitter or whatever, actually made me much better at backing up my arguments in essays and things like that, and doing my research better, and just always making sure I was referring to the primary sources, which is a skill which can take quite a while to learn, just the sort of habit of always backing everything up. And I think a lot of reenactors, gain a lot of skills that you get from studying history at university level. And in terms of the other way around, as I said before, it's been a way to sort of apply my research and get a bit closer to the people that I'm reading about every day. On a small scale, some of there's been a sort of element of experimental archaeology in that. One thing I was researching into a cavalry patrol that was halted by the first Black Watch in 1914 during the retreat from Mons, by building a barricade of logs and barbed wire across the road. And we knew which sort of model in the 1911 Manual of Field Engineering they'd built it from. And I thought, I'm not convinced that this is right. We had several different accounts saying different things. So we just built it and had a look and said, would that stop a horse? And yes, it absolutely would. So it didn't exactly completely solve the issue that I was looking to solve, but it meant that we could just have an extra dimension to understand. So in both ways, each reenactment, living history, and academia both help each other, absolutely. I was going to sort of pick up on what Josh was saying before about sort of writing these up to help other people in the hobby, historians, research. I do worry sometimes that people not exactly don't know how to research, but just don't know the full, the amazing breadth and variety of material that there is out there, and sort of where to find it and everything. And I feel like people like us should really, obviously you are making the effort to get it out there to people. It's not just about knowing about the color of Blanco, that's a small detail, but it's really about knowing they knew. So think about things like the manuals, things like, there's a copy of the 98 service book that's an aid memoir to everything that or should have known at that point. I mean, I think for about 20 on eBay,
your audio is breaking up a bit at the moment, Rowan, for some
that
reason.
sort of price to be all that in a system like Montys Men, I think things that you can do in the hobby.
Yeah, so your audio was breaking up a little bit there for some reason, Rowan. We'll come back to you in a second because Joshua.
Now?
I think so. We'll come back to him. Thanks for that. Great stuff. I'm going to bring Joshua in because he's wanted to jump in about interviewing veterans. Because this is something I was also discussing with Marcel, who's going to be on Friday's show. Is that he was talking about researching an attack on a town by the American Second Armored Division in Germany. I think it was Germany, and how the best way of understanding how it would have unfolded is get a unit historian who understands all the movements of the division, a local who has access to what the locals said about where people were coming from, and a guy who actually drove half track to say, no, they wouldn't have gone over that slope there because that's too steep. They would have come in that way because that ground, and the three or four of these people, by coming at it from their different set of skills, would be able to theoretically offer a more complete and detailed idea of that attack than just going to one of them. And I think that's kind of where you want to come in about veterans, because I've talked about on this channel before, there's some incredible archives out there of oral interviews with veterans, sometimes by schools or universities, but sometimes, no disrespect to the interviewers, they're not asking the right questions. They're coming in with where were you when war was declared? How did you get enlisted? Which battles did you fight? And it's a standard approach there. But as a living historian, you would be able to ask veterans a different set of questions that would help understand a different set of things. So Josh, and Simon's nodding as well, but Joshua, I think interviewing veterans is something you wanted to particularly talk about.
Yeah, so we've interviewed a little over a dozen veterans from the specific battalion of the 399 Free Portray and over 20 from the 100th Division generally. And I know exactly of the sort of oral history projects that you speak. The Library of Congress has a number, and no disrespect to Eagle Scouts. Tom was an Eagle Scout. I was in Boy Scouts prior to that. Their sort of veteran interviews are often like, Where did you fight? And the guy goes, I fought in France. And that's the end of it, which it makes it kind of a useless sort of interview, because we all know the US fought in France. So when we do an interview prep, and it's a whole process of a sheet, we not only get his name and everything like that, we already know his enlistment date. We already know what company he served in. We already know, if we can, through other sources, who his squad mates were. We find out if he was wounded, when he was wounded, what was happening in the company, battalion, regiment when he was wounded, and pretty much every single, and see, oh, is he mentioned in this memoir? Oh, okay, what story can be attached to that, and kind of have a kind of suite of information so we can go into it. So it's the difference between like asking any one of you, hey, what was the day like in third grade, versus, hey, do you remember in this fall semester around September 30th in third grade in Miss Johnson's class, do you remember the quiz on multiplication tables? One, by its specificity, is going to elucidate a better answer. And while we do occasionally ask like the question about, hey, do you remember getting field jackets or shoe packs? That really isn't the focus, because, kind of as Ed alluded to, that isn't at the forefront of their mind. We might get, yeah, I remember getting one of those in September before we went overseas, or yeah, I got new socks and whatever. A lot of our questions are more focused on how they survived, what of specific battles they may have participated in, do they remember, or further explaining. Like, there's a couple company histories that have inside jokes that you could tell is a joke, you could tell it's an inside joke, but because we weren't in the company in 1943-44, it goes over our head. So sometimes we will interviewing veterans like, hey, on page 63 of the company history, there's this comment. Can you kind of explain the joke behind this? And I think we are in a position, by our unit's specificity, to kind of bring that further out. And by doing, and that's really something we are, as a hobby, are really in a position to do so. And by the fact that we have all this material culture, that tactile ability to bring a helmet or a rifle to a veteran, and he has it in his hands, can oftentimes bring out memories that an ordinary interviewer might not have been able to bring out. And that's happened when we've interviewed Bob Karzian, when he was talking about how he cut down a Nazi flag and made a red scarf, or in a more heartbreaking tone, him holding a helmet told the story about one of his best friends from the individual replacement training program, how he died in front of his eyes, and how a guy that was wounded at the same time took a helmet and placed it in his hands, or a rifle in the hands of someone in D Company, how he, during the occupation duty, how he saw a German in the middle of a field that had blown his legs off by stepping on a landmine that hadn't been discovered, and how they shot him to put him out of his misery, because they looked around and they knew how long a guy who had blown off his legs via a landmine knew how to last. And that, like, it takes probably going to take an hour to drive into town. It's going to take an hour to get to combat engineers and medics. It's going to take another hour to get back to the field. And by the time that happens, the guy's going to be bled out and dead. And they just shot him and continued on because they all knew. And I think that sort of human nature of the war, that deep down individual, not the history of the generals, but the history of the common squaddies in the British Parliament, or the common doughboy or GI, is really what is our specialty. Because it's hard to overstate from interviews and memoirs how tiny the soldier's war is. If the guy wasn't in, somebody wasn't in the same platoon or the same squad, oftentimes might as well have been on Mars. And so many of these battles that seem like these great maneuvers, Don Donaghy described the entirety of the Vosges campaign as 2 months of, they'd wake up in the morning, there'd be a hill that they needed to take, they'd shoot at the hill, they'd get on top of the hill, they'd dig in, they'd be shelled for a little bit, they'd go to sleep, and repeat for more or less 2 months, with occasionally being a break to get hot showers and food, and being able to bring that sort of ant-sized view of the war. It kind of drive home how, while Eisenhower or Devers or anybody else like that were drawing these arrows on the map, the common soldier, that was a huge abstraction and nothing. And if it was out of eyesight, it didn't matter and it didn't exist, as I think something that we are in such a great position to do, not only for our own research and reading memoirs, but in particular by doing interviews, but specifically effective interviews that not only talk about Kit, but talk about more generally the soldier's life and experience in a really detailed, specific way.
Yeah, no, absolutely perfect answer. And I'm going to go to Rowan in a minute. But before I do, I'm going to just want to come back to a couple of things you said, and Simon wants to come in as well, and probably Ed as well. First thing is, interviewing is all about creating a comfortable environment for the interviewee, isn't it? And if you are there and you understand some of the things he's talking about, even peripherally, okay, you weren't in the Vosges bands, but you, when he would say a particular campaign, you would kind of roll your eyes in a way that would give him the understanding that you know what he's talking about. He would mention a certain commander or a certain date. So you're creating empathy, you're creating sympathy, and he feels he can talk to you because he trusts you because you get it. And I have that as a Normandy battlefield guy where veterans have told me stuff they're not telling their families or sitting there because I'm saying, they might mention, oh, of course, we got towards Chateau Lalonde, and I go, oh yeah, shit, and they'll go, and the family go, what? So, well, that's where a lot of them are killed. But I've immediately shown that acknowledgement of something that he is feeling it uncomfortable to talk about. So because I recognise his uncomfort with it, a bond is created between us. So another thing I always talk about is again this asking the right questions and knowing how to ask them, which is going to bring Rowan in again, because hopefully your audio is better this time. I don't know what was going on last time, but because there is an academic way, there is an understood way of interviewing people. So as a reenactor and academic, oral histories, Rowan.
Yes. Is the sound any better now?
Seems to be so far, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I claim to be an expert on oral history because my main area, obviously, nobody's alive from that time. But what I was going to say is that if you were to conduct oral history as an academic working in a university or a student, you would generally have to submit your questions and your plan beforehand to an ethics committee, and to have the university or the governing sign off on what you were going to do, in order for one reason to make sure that, but also to make sure that you're not asking questions which will make the answers of the interviewee any more subjective, or sort of, so basically, so you don't ask leading questions, and that I think can discourage historians from asking the sort of really detailed questions to know the answers to as reenactors. This process is important though, because in the 1980s there was quite a famous study done by a historian called Alistair Thompson of ANZAC, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps veterans of the Gallipoli campaign. And while he got a lot of useful information from it, some of them he realised were recounting films from the 1981 Mel Gibson film, recounting scenes from that as episodes of their own life. I think simply because they asked the same questions and told the same story again and again for however many decades by that point. But so academic historians are somewhat limited in what they can ask as oral historians, but as reenactors, we're not. And so I think as long as it's done, in good taste, and the people that you're interviewing are comfortable with it, I think reenactors have the opportunity to relate to the people they're interviewing more and get, the answers to the detailed questions that we really want to know, possibly more academic historians do.
No, perfect point. And again, it comes back to what we were just saying about if you could go back in time 20 years, because you're a lot younger than me, Rowan, and interview a guy who was in the Black Watch in 1939, but you were also wearing a 1939 Black Watch battle dress, again, you would theoretically create a level of empathy and understanding and mutual kind of respect immediately, where perhaps someone sitting behind a desk in an interview environment in a university, perhaps there's kind of audio, there's soundproofing in the room there, maybe it's an environment that looks a little bit more intimidating, kind of maybe look like a police cell. Whereas if you're at an event there and you're sitting over in a mug of tea in an enamel mug, you're creating an environment that is more conducive, I would suggest, to getting information. But Simon, again, because you're more at my end of the scale of age, so you have knocked around with a few more veterans, I think. So I think you want to add something about this research and veterans and
just with a different hat on. The Channel Islands Occupation Society in Jersey looks after a number of the German fortifications, with a view to restoring them as much as possible to how they were in 1945. And I was working with one of the groups on one of the bunkers at Corbière. We've been working on this bunker for probably 20 years. And there was all sorts of questions, all sorts of things we didn't know, how things worked. And we've just had drawn a blank. We opened the bunker to the public during the summer. And one day, a chap came in. And he walked into the bunker. He was of military age from World War II. And he said to us, he was the commandant of that bunker in World War II. And he then burst into tears. And it was a very emotional moment for him. He had come back for the first time since World War II. He had expected to find the bunker he commanded in ruins. And it was a fairly respectable representation of what it should have been. But from that point, the level, the questions that we had for him were just, obviously they went off the charts and we had to be somewhat careful. But over 2 or 3 years, we cultivated a very close relationship with him. And he was very patient with the hundreds of questions that we threw at him. And he gave us a recount of his time in the bunker and what happened and how it worked, and all sorts of little anecdotes that would have been just lost to history had we not met him. And we were just so lucky to have met him. And obviously he was from the enemy, our enemy. So there was that aspect to perhaps overcome. But what a fascinating opportunity to be involved in the restoration of a German fortification and then actually meet the chap who was in command of it in 1944. Absolutely something I will never, ever forget.
And again, it comes back to that time you're committing, because museums don't, often underfunded. How many staff have they got? How many, there are places that cannot be manned 365 days a year. But if there's a public event and there's reenactors, living historians there's more people there for the public to talk to. There's people can come over and they might feel more willing to speak to someone standing there with a battle dress on, drinking from a mug of tea, than they would someone in the museum itself, a member of staff wearing a tie. I'm not saying that those people aren't doing their jobs well, but it's a connectivity that we're talking about. But I'm conscious of the fact we're an hour and a half in, and it's fascinating. And I think we are probably winning over some people. I know Brad from the Staying Canadian Military History has a bit of he's not anti-reenactment, but he's a bit arms folded about it, and is finding this really enlightening. So the next question on my list, we should do the ones that are that I put on the YouTube description, is simple response, we don't have to go into much detail. What is your response to people who just say, you're just dressing up, you're playing at soldiers, you're being disrespectful? I know you've already kind of answered these questions in why you do it, but let's just go around and say, because it is a question that you would get, what's your pattern? We'll bring Ed in. What do you say when people say you're just dressing up?
Yes.
Yes.
When a directed question that's criticizing what you're doing comes at you, I think the modern world is very sensitive, and people are very sensitive about what you say to them and they might analyze what you're doing in a different way to how you analyze doing it yourself. So if someone comes at me with a question like that, you're probably not going to get anywhere engaging in an argument with them. And I'm quite tempted to play devil's advocate and say yes. And my own grandfather, my own flesh and blood, said to me, "You're doing for fun what I did for real." And that's my right. I think the thing about disrespect is, it can be done disrespectfully, and we've all seen that, and that is infuriating. It can be done disrespectfully, but very often that is not by the type of people who are within this discussion. And I think that the reason I know that it's not disrespectful is because when you get stood in front of a veteran, in the garb, and they're stood there looking at you, and they're looking you up and down, and then they're thinking lots and lots and lots of things. The discussion that will come from them is very often a key indicator that they respect what you're doing, because they will fire things at you, like things you never even thought of in your life, like, just get that mess tin out for me. You get it out, and then they want to see what's in it. Or, you'll learn more from them questioning you than you ever will by asking them, because they're like reflecting on their own personal experiences. So that tells them that you've actually probably contributed something to their day about what they did. So that would be my simple answer to it.
Super. Joshua, you next. You're muted, Josh.
Kind of to echo Ed's point, like to an extent, yeah, we're dressing up. As to disrespect point, I would disagree, and I think more importantly, I think the current division, the progeny of the division, and the veterans we've had the pleasure of interacting with, in some cases having years-long friendships with, would wholeheartedly disagree. And I think it's because of not only of the events we've done, but because of everything we've done for the unit's history in terms of photograph digitization, motion picture digitization, interviews that we've conducted to preserve these oral histories, finding every single memoir ever written by a member of the division and digitizing it and donating a copy to the division library. The same thing for missing unit histories. We paid to have one that was located in a random library in Germany digitized and donated to the division library to host on their website. And as well as, and not to get into it, to preserve that online repository that the Division Association put up, because it's currently under threat due to some machinations with the foundation that the Division Association gave it to. And that's led to the current division bringing us in several times to give talks about the division's history during the war, to progeny reaching out to us, and in some cases just recently being invited to the funeral of a dear close veteran of the unit, not in kit to do a reflaying or something like that, but as a trusted member of the family to mourn his passing and to help some of the family members who might not fully understand what his combat service was like to more understand what it was like. And then, of course, I think the best illustration of this, and this is probably better understood from the American audience and the British audience, for that first national reunion that we attended, that was really the thing that tipped us over the scales into portraying the 100th Division permanently and nothing else. We showed up in a dress uniform because that's the kind of occasion that it should be, but we didn't want to wear any ribbons or awards because that's always a touchy subject. And when we showed up doing that, all the veterans that we were sitting with and hanging with got on our case, being like, what are you doing? You should be wearing a combat infantryman badge. We earned that. You're portraying us well. And by Jove, we earned a combat infantry badge, and you're going to show us wearing a combat infantry badge. Now put it on. And that sort of trust by the veterans in us portraying it correctly, and them themselves telling us to wear certain awards that can be troublesome, I think is the best way to put it, was itself kind of the best endorsement that I could ever want. And I think
it's a good card to draw. It's a good card to play when you get that question, because medals and medal ribbons were a topic in the sidebar for a few minutes earlier. So, I always had a problem with that. My last event in Arnhem,
Yeah.
Greg, who is Ed's boss in Montys Men and Simon's boss, wanted all of the airborne recce guys to wear the parachute wings because by Arnhem, everybody in 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron was parachute trained. And I held back and I said, I'll do everything else. I'm just not wearing the wings. I just haven't earned them, won't wear them. And I had this personal thing that if there's one thing a veteran would pick me up on that's wrong, it would be I'd rather be wrong for not wearing the wings than wrong for wearing them when I didn't earn them. So I will still die on that bridge. No pun intended when we talk about Arnhem. That was a really bad pun to use, dying on a bridge. But I will die on that hill. I would rather have been criticized for incorrectly not wearing something I was entitled to than the other way. But you make a very good point there. So Rowan, same question to you. Someone tells you you're just dressing up, mate. What's your answer?
Well, instinct is usually to get quite annoyed about it, but then I think really, yes, we are dressing up, but I think people are never going to realize how difficult it is to dress up like that. And I'm not just talking about getting into the kit, because as you surmised earlier, it is very difficult to get into some of the Scottish kit, even with a soldier servant to help you. But I think because one of the most enjoyable parts of the hobby for me is creating the impressions and putting together bits of kit and think, especially with the Scottish stuff and the Scottish officer stuff, when hardly any of it's reproduced, and I've got to think, right, well, I could make this into this, or I could get this privately made here and things. The amount of work that goes into this dressing up sort of negates that comment in itself. I mean, yeah, that the Scottish officer's full dress on the left last photo that take from acquiring the first bit of it, completing it last year. But also, what I was sort of saying earlier before I got cut off with the sound is that all people see is the dressing up, but really what matters is up there. What knowing the things that they knew, and what really comes out in events like Montys Men. Knowing things like hand signals, formations, how to dig the trenches, how to build the barbed wire formations, how to maintain rifles and the vehicles. All these things that make it. That's what makes it more than dressing up. Is what's in your head, not what you're wearing. Although what you're wearing is important, and farbs shouldn't be allowed to exist.
Yeah, and which brings us, and I'll bring in Simon again, which brings us to the fact that people have recognized on the sidebar that I brought in some people at one end of the reenactment spectrum, and there are people at the other end who don't have anything like the same passion, dedication, research that you guys show, and there's nothing we can do about that. I mean, it's the same as if I'm doing a show, as I was last week on Chesty Pullet on Guadalcanal. I brought in a historian who has lived on Guadalcanal, who has studied that, who was a Marine, who knows that subject intimately. I will get the best I can for that. I could probably find some guy, Joe Schmo, in somewhere other, who's read a couple of Guadalcanal books and have put together a blog. I can invite him on, but I don't. I go for the best of the best. And to kind of bring it to the defense of the hobby, we all know there's a bad side. We all know there's crap people here. I live in Normandy. I live in the Mecca. I think Normandy and Gettysburg probably, and maybe Bastogne, are the meccas of shit reenactment. That's where they gather in their droves come anniversary time. I've seen every conceivable farbiness, which is, for those who watch who don't understand where that expression of farb comes from, it's so far be it from me to say. I've seen it all, but I still defend the principle of it being done well. So to kind of round things off, the last round of kind of questions is what can the hobby do to improve? But I mean improving it from your position, who are already high, because there's nothing we can set up as many sets of rules. I mean, there was the Helen Patton Reenactors Charter a few years ago. She tried to get off the ground. Other people have tried to set up these things of these events must have these criteria, but you can't stop people turning up no matter what you do. Unless it's a private event like Montys Men do, you can have all the paperwork in place, and then some idiot will turn up with a, mirror shades and a Colt 45 and a shoulder holster and a we can't do anything about that. But what can you guys who represent the better end, what are the ways the hobby can improve and it's self-examined? So let's go to Simon first.
Sure. It's all about standards. It's all about maintaining standards. I would always say, I'd always recommend to people organising events to only invite well-respected, well-established units. If you're doing public events, you want to show the best. I would actually discourage the public from dressing up and joining in. I know a lot of organisers of events like to do that, but really that's where things can fall down quite substantially. So proper units with an authenticity officer who knows their stuff, coaching the new guys, bringing the new guys in, showing them the standards that are expected, where to get the kit, what kit to get, what kit to avoid, and why. And I know a lot of it is down to pricing and cost. If you've got a proper unit established, you're likely to have some spare kit lying around. So give that to the new guys. Help them with their standards, help everybody with their standards, and try and enforce the standards. So that's my.
Yeah, and I think well, I'm sure the others will elaborate. It's not just about the kit as well. It's about the bearing. It's about the attitude. Is that the minute you put a uniform on that someone has died in, I don't mean the actual jacket was worn by someone who died. I mean people were killed in the uniform you're representing. Comes responsibility. Comes a responsibility to those people who wore that uniform for real, and there's a responsibility to the public you are standing in front of to do that. And again, we can't do anything about the crappy people except maybe try and by inspiring them, by setting a high standard, by trying to suggest what is right and what is decent, and discussions like this hope they want to aim higher, and accepting the fact that some of them won't want to. But let's bring Ed in now, because how can the hobby improve?
Okay, so the hobby has one big challenge, which is very difficult, and that is the cost it is to get into it. The kit is extremely expensive now, and you made the point at the start that you're not going to get any change out of £1,500 to get yourself stood up looking good. So that is a huge challenge to the hobby, because it's a barrier to new entrants coming in, youngsters coming in. So that is a problem, and one of the only ways you can deal with that is by lending kit, which, as Mr. Dodkins was saying. But I think really the one thing that our hobby, and it is a niche, we are in a niche group here of people. There's probably 250 Brits in Europe that do it to this standard, and that's on a good day. It goes back to, have you seen the Patrick Swayze film Roadhouse? Where they
there's a nice weird 1980s reference.
Yeah. Tight jeans and all that good stuff. That he has a mantra which he tells his bouncers, and he says, "Be nice." And nice is a horrible word. Lots of people hate it for lots of reasons, but we need to try and be nicer to each other. There are a lot of, and it's not specific to British groups, or German groups or American groups, or we need to talk to each other like human beings, and you have to understand that sometimes the person you're talking to might not have the same set of values and standards that you do. So be nice would be a good start, and I'm lucky that I've surrounded myself with lots of people who are a lot of good fun, and people will come with you on the journey if you look like you're enjoying it. And so it's a fine line between constructive criticism and having a go at someone. So I think that's probably what we can do. And then, I mean, the second thing is, and Monty's Men are struggling with this at the moment, getting people to get involved. I mean, we have got a fabulous event lined up for end of June. And when we originally put it to the community, we had 240 blokes book on, plus Jerry's. So 290 blokes book on. And 290 blokes. That's a good sized British company with a good sized opposition, and we're down to 100 now, plus opposition, so 150 call it, and that kills it for the organisers. When you're out there trying to put a good event on, which is not cheap, it is not cheap to come on a Montys Men, and it shouldn't be. When people that you can find every excuse under the sun not to go and do something. And if you thought about anything in depth, you probably wouldn't do it. You probably wouldn't even cross the road. So support these groups, support Dodkins over on the islands, support the First World War British group, go out and get involved. If Americans what you're into, support Joshua's group. Go out and find those groups that put these events on and support them, because they are going to die if we're not careful.
No, good point. And getting into the hobby isn't easy, and it's expensive. And again, we're talking about the fact that at the level of depth you do it, it's harder. It's much easier to do it at the easy end. It's easy for a vehicle owner who's got a Jeep to just buy the cheapest replica M43 you can get, and the cheap this, and the cheap, and go out and do it badly, and not have to worry about whether or not he knows that it's the right pattern shirt that goes with the right pattern jacket, blah, blah, blah. But the more as the pyramid gets towards the top, the more niche it gets, the more expensive it gets, and the harder it gets. And the commitment, as you said right at the beginning, Ed, you don't really enjoy the events. You enjoy the talking back about the events afterwards. And having done a couple of Montys Men events myself back in the day, I don't know that I did enjoy them at the time. It was afterwards proud I'd done them. So let's bring Rowan in now, because again, as from the academic side, and I definitely in our next two shows this week, we're going to talk about how the regular history world, so the authors, the museums, need to embrace more what you guys are doing and bring you with them in their projects. And we're going to be talking about that later. But again, Rowan, what self-criticism, how do you think Scots at War and the people you know can work harder to make things better?
I think a big part of it is, like I sort of alluded to before, is increasing awareness of the resources that are out there and sort of helping people to help themselves. Because I can, tell somebody exactly what they need to portray a Second World War Black Watch soldier. But that doesn't mean that they're going to then have an understanding of, what life was like for those soldiers, or, even, what the kit they're actually wearing is, or how to wear it, and that sort of thing. But there are brilliant resources, like there are loads of manuals, British manuals that have been digitized on archive.org. Richard Fisher, the Vickers Machine Society, has been doing a lot of that. It's been really good. People don't know about resources like that. Of course, there are sort of the more well-known ones like the Imperial War Museum Photo Archive and stuff like that. I feel like it's just, we need to encourage people to be able to do their own research as well as other questions. And I do get a lot of messages from people asking how to do various things, and I'm always happy to answer it. But I'd like to be able to make more resources available, or make it more widely known. And we sort of did a bit of that in Scots at War, and during the pandemic, we did a series of live various different aspects of the First World War and reenacting and stuff. But it sort of petered out. On my own YouTube channel, I've done videos on tactics, a bit of field engineering, and some stuff on kit, to try and get those ideas out there and to sort of show what I think people should be learning, really. But it's all about people creating the opportunities for people to go out and learn for themselves, I think, because there's only so much the group can do in giving out kit lists and things. And in fact, just going back to sort of Montys Men, like, I've never attended, but I've seen like the kit lists that you hand out and stuff, and obviously it's very specific and very thorough. But these guys then turn up, not knowing how to act as a section and things, and obviously they learn that at the weekend. But if people were looking at these manuals and stuff, I think that would be really good for the hobby generally.
No, definitely. And we'll bring in Joshua in a minute, but I think to add to my take on it is that some reenactment groups I've been involved with over the years, living history groups, they need to be a bit more open and better at communicating as well. I mean, sure, I can definitely see that museums, proper historians, I don't mean you aren't proper, but the writers should embrace more what the reenactor can offer. But I think reenactors sometimes maybe don't do themselves the best with their PR, that it's all a bit, it's our club, it's our thing, it's for us. And I think maybe more of the group website saying about, here's what we offer to other people, here's a resource for family members, here's a resource, here's how we can help authors, here's how we can help museums. Maybe that's a bit another focus, because I'm always talking about moving together on a broad front, in that comic book writers, video gamers, YouTubers, historical writers, we're all part of the same thing, which is trying to share the past through different media. And living history is a way of sharing the past, as is writing comics, as is everything else. So if we all cross-pollinate and talk to each other, there's more chance of us moving forward in that direction. So Joshua, I'll bring you in now. So, because you were the one who wanted to bring this point up, point six, the sixth question was yours, so about being self-critical. So again, we are representing the creme de la creme here, apart from Ed. No, I'm joking, Ed, but so Joshua, how can we improve?
So I think Simon brings up a great point about helping within the unit. And I think in our unit, and I think a lot of units, if they have this mindset, would improve, which is you're only as authentic as your least authentic member. And by being a group effort and not leaving the new guy to work it out on your own, really brings everybody up. But I think more generally is, I think a lot more research and reading needs to be done. My friend Tom has a big thing. Reenactors need to read. If it's memoirs, if it's manuals, if it's various doctrinal documents, or if it's even a general World War II history, that's all great, but they need to read more. And I think he wrote an article to try to help reenactors understand all the resources that for an American reenactor they have, like on how to do all that research, what archives to go to, and what archives have digital collections that you can use. But I think at the end of the day, it's that key point that more research needs to be done, and it's not simply enough, unfortunately, to plug in 100th Infantry Division into Google, press enter, and check out the first 2 or 3 pages, or to check out Google Books or archive.org, or even something more esoteric like the Command and General Staff College's online collection. At the end of the day, you're probably going to have to hit in a car or hop on a train, go down to the National Archives, or I don't know about the situation in England, maybe a regimental museum and archives, and open up some acid-free boxes and folders with a digital camera and start snapping photographs, because that's really the best way and oftentimes the most definitive way to answer not only questions from a historical perspective, but also the sort of questions that interest reenactors. And I think that's really what even the top 50%, even top 20%, or even in the 100th, there's a ton of stuff that I wish I'd researched earlier. And so much of my job is there's so many times where it's like, where there's an artist friend of mine once said, there's no artist that is happy with any art that they made 5 years ago. Yep. And as a reenactor, there's very few impressions of mine that I can look at 5 years on and be like, yeah, that's authentic still. Oftentimes it's like, I'm wearing that chin strap slightly differently than it turned out I was wearing in there. Or I did a bazooka impression one time, and after digitizing a ton of motion pictures like we did, and I had a much bigger range of primary sources of how bazooka gunners in the 399th carried themselves, I was like, I'm carrying too many ammunition bags compared to what they should have been carrying in April 45 and stuff like that. And I think the more research, the better. And I think a way to get yourself to do more research is to kind of go, never to rest on your laurels. And like so many other things in life, if you're not moving forward, in some ways you're falling back. And you gotta move forward, and you gotta find more research and find those dark niches and crevices that you could find at any different archive to try to collectively, not just individually, but as a group, build together that impression, that like understanding of the unit. So we have guys that focus on the demobilization of the unit. We have guys that focus on ordnance and quartermaster corps and stuff like that. And that sort of collective effort to have a holistic understanding of the division and the soldier in the war is, I think, key, which goes back to central point, more research and more reading, permit, just end of story. The more of that done, the better. And
I would add that with reenactors, Ed made up the big point, the good point about the money it costs. And I saw there's a brand new, a mutual friend of some of us, Steve Kiddle's just shown photos of his latest batch of replica Denison smocks on Facebook today, and they are awesome. And if I was a living historian who had a Denison smock that I bought a couple of years ago that cost me a few hundred, and now seeing this one, it's like, yes, it's definitely better, but can I justify another however many £100 it is to improve it by another 2%, because the general public aren't necessarily going to notice that Denison smock is slightly better than the early one, but because it's money. But some of the stuff living historians can do to improve themselves doesn't cost anything at all. I mean, I did, when the Montys Men were in France, whichever year it was, and I met them down in the Falaise Gap, and I did a little talk to them on the bridge in Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, which means Brad from On This Day in Canadian History is now picking up now because it's major Canadian action in the Falaise Gap, South Alberta and what have you. I gave them a little presentation for 20 minutes on what happened there, and bar 2 or 3 of the guys, most of them didn't know that action. And that's no reflection on their knowledge. They knew about the uniforms they were wearing that day. They knew about whichever unit they were presenting. I think it was Welsh Regiment that year. I can't remember which one it was. Yeah. But there's more work the reenactors can do about the history that doesn't cost anything at all. They can go on the line immediately and find war diaries to download. They can do that. So it's I would say, as a former living historian, because when I knew less about the history than I knew about the uniforms. I could have learned more about the war diary histories when I was reenacting, but I was focused on the infamous "was my Blanco the right shade?" and those kind of details of, are these the best replica badges I can get for the 56th Brigade, which I was doing with 2nd Essex back at the time. So I was a bit focused on the uniform, and I could have been more focused on the history that goes with it. So I think that's something that reenactors could generally improve their knowledge of the broad history, maybe not in Joshua's case, but I think we will bring things to an end now. And obviously, we haven't talked about the bad side of it particularly. We've emphasizing the fact we're speaking to 4 people at the top of their game, in very, very good units, and hopefully we can convert some people there. But before we bring this one to an end, anyone got any final points they want to make about what they do and why they do it? Anything that you haven't felt you've covered earlier? Ed,
I have got one thing I haven't covered, which is we haven't talked about civilians at all.
No.
And we talked a lot about veterans and the military actions. But my best experience from World War II history, whatever you want to call it, was going to Holland and meeting people who are in their 90s now, who were children during the German occupation of Holland, who were 9, 10, 11. And we haven't talked about the civilians at all. And I learned more about Compo from 9-year-old little girls in Holland whilst travelling around, opening a Compo crate and throwing it in front of them, and them going, I remember that. I remember nicking those from British squaddies from a barn over there, and them chasing me, and then catching up with me saying, oh, go on then, you can have it. And, it's not just the military side. There's a real human side, which we're seeing around the world at the moment in other events. And it's that real human side in Holland that really touched home for me while I do it. Because that's
what we're going to be covering a little bit on Friday with Marcel, talking about traveling to Europe. He does with the American 2nd Armored Division. They have literally taken convoys of 8 M8 armored cars and 2 Shermans and a dozen half tracks into towns in the Czech Republic that last saw that amount of vehicles going through them in 1945 when the 2nd Armored Division went through that town the first time. And the point we're going to make on Friday is a 10-year-old kid witnessing the recreation of it was going to have as much a vivid memory of that as a 10-year-old kid witnessing it for real in 1945. Okay, there are no enemy on the recreation trips, and the weapons don't have rounds in them, and the tanks can't actually fire their weapons, but the visual impact on the public will be exactly the same. And that's ultimately, for the people who knock reenactment, it's going to carry on. Reenactment and a 3D all senses way of learning about World War II is going to be an important aspect of conveying the past to people, because that's what living history does at its best. It's an all senses environment. You're hearing a Simon bellow out orders to his section of Force 135. You're hearing the crunch of hobnails on the cobblestones. You can smell the surge. You can smell the blanco, the tea, and that visual image can do much more than reading a panel on the side of a building that says Force 35 were here in 1945 for 3 months, and there's a grey blurry photo of a couple of blokes there. That idea there. So yeah, I think we've kind of gone around the houses on this. Have you enjoyed? Yes,
Woody, the only other question is the comments on the left. There's been some really good questions from some of your participants. Does that come up on YouTube later on?
Yeah, all the comments will be there later on. Yes, and folks, I'm sorry I haven't got to all the questions. I'm glad that people have been adding lots of stuff there. That all that live chat will be there to look at later on. And I just realised we're just going to be here for hours if we do all the questions there, and we haven't finished yet. And we've got 2 more shows. And again, I'm hoping that this will lead to another debate on some, as we said at the beginning, some of the meatier topics. And I know Simon's got some interesting views on the recreating of Germans, because as again, Jersey actually saw Germans. I've got a reenactor from Poland who does British reenactment there. And Poland, of course, saw about as shitty a war as any country saw between 39 and 45. And how different is reenactment in a country that actually saw wholesale bloodshed and the Holocaust? Because that's another level of depth that, for all what you, Rowan, Joshua, Ed, and Simon are doing, Poland had a very different war than Jersey had, and New Jersey definitely had. So that's another aspect for later on. But anyone else? Rowan, got any points? Simon, got any points? Joshua?
I was just going to jump on what you said about the Poles there, in that. So with the Defend Fife event that I mentioned earlier, we do that in partnership with Polish reenactors, and it's partly funded by the Polish government, because there were Polish soldiers who took over those defences from the 7th Black Watch after they left to go and train for North Africa. And so we've got very close links with the still Polish community in Fife, and with the Polish soldiers and their descendants from that area. And it really does give you an appreciation that it is a completely different war that impact, and there were people impacted by that here as well. And it is, it's part of our war and part of their war. And it's all, I feel important to then living history, bring that to life.
No, definitely. And the whole idea of the fact that there was a survey done about 15 years ago, if I remember correctly, where they did a team of historians went around different countries and played a word association game where they threw phrases from the war and then recorded what the standard reactions were. And they change as you go around the world. And if I remember correctly, in America, there are lots of things like Glenn Miller, music, Betty Grable, kind of positive images, some of the word association stuff. In Britain, there was some more negative. There was the Blitz, rationing, things like that. Poland, Holocaust, deportation, death. And so we need to, as a collective, whether we're academic historians, YouTubers, reenactors, understand that people's perception of World War II is very different depending on where you're from. And so the rules of engagement, so to speak, about going to a living history event, as Joshua does in the East Coast of the USA, is different to the responsibilities that Simon has in Jersey, that Ed has when Montys Men come over to Normandy, for example. The different level of responsibility there than there would be if you're doing it in the field, and so on and so forth. So there's lots more things we can go into in the future. To answer the question that we had in a sidebar, yes, Montys Men are going to Warfest again this year. So for those who enjoyed seeing them there mucking around with tanks, they're going again this year. I may be there myself, which means I may go and have a couple of sherbets with my Montys Men pals, if they let me. That would be nice. So we'll see. So I'll just remind people what we've got coming up, and I'll say goodbye to you in a second, folks. So I'm glad you've stuck with it. I know people who are watching this who are more from the academic side. James Jeffries, Brad, you guys are watching it. You come into this a bit arms folded. I think you've learned a few things. I think you've taken a few ideas. That's good. I'm hoping some interesting feedback in the comments when more people watch this over the next few days. And we haven't finished yet. We've got 2 more shows to go. So tomorrow night, Taff Gillingham, Kate Vigers, and Alex Burnham are joining me. So all of these are people who do living history professionally, and 2 of them had also done it as a hobby. So that's about how it works in an educational aspect. And then Friday, so the gap on Thursday, Friday, we're talking to people who have a connection with living history but don't necessarily do it themselves. So check the listings. And as usual, folks, if you are new to the channel, don't forget to click like, don't forget to click subscribe. Go to Rowan's channel, like his channel. Go to Joshua's YouTube page, go to and see what they're doing. Go to Simon's Facebook page, go to Montys Men and see some of the photos of lots of guys in surge. The only thing about Montys Men website is it doesn't come with the smelly vision function, because I'm sure if you could go to like day 4 of those events and you could turn on the smell, it would be amazing. I could tell you about the trip we did when it wasn't really Montys Men, but it was Dunkirk, when we came back on the P&O ferries from Calais to Dover, and the French guy in the bar came up to us, and we were wondering why no one was sitting near us. And he came up and it was very friendly. He said, "Messieurs, you all, how do I say, smell." And I hadn't realized just how stinky we'd got walking however many miles we did from Cassel towards the beach. But anyway, so that's it. We're done. So thank you, Ed. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Rowan, for sharing your expertise and knowledge. And I'm hoping that other living historians who are watching this, reenactors, whatever they're going to call themselves, will feel more comfortable about coming forward on a future show, because I did approach a lot of people who just didn't want to come on this, particularly those who portray the German side of things. And in order to give them a fair crack of the whip and see what they're put, I would really want to speak to people who do the other side of things and allow them the chance to be grilled in a friendly environment. But I say I didn't find many takers for that, but maybe this will open the door a bit. So that's it. So folks, thank you very much for your attention this evening. I will see you all again tomorrow, and thank you to our participants. Cheers, everybody. Good evening.
Thank
Bye.
you. Goodbye. Cheers.